Good morning, folks. Time for some news with the morning coffee. So, I was reading this article on Haaretz, or an analysis, saying that Biden's message to Israel after Iran attack: quit while you're ahead. And so it goes on to say, after the US went above and beyond to help Israel successfully intercept Iran's attack, the president is now aiming his sights at Israel's leaders to avoid further escalation that could lead to all out war in the region, telling them that they should take this win and move on. And this was written by Ben Samuels. And I found it a bit interesting because basically, I think what's going on here is that the US is trying to sell the successful defense of Iran's attack against Israel, or Iran's response to Israel's attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, as a huge win in and of itself, and that the everybody should stop from that point on. And I think that Iran and the US coordinated this attack in order to allow Iran to save face and for Israel to achieve restoring its defense or security capacity. Because you might remember that every single time there's talk about Israel, Israel talks about Israeli security, and every time a external politician, like an ambassador at the UN, talks about Israel, they always keep bringing up the same thing: security, security, security. Israel is fucking obsessed with security. Everything is in Israel's security interest. So, I want to have a quick look at this. So, basically, we're at April 15th, 2024. And I think that eschatologists are desperate for the United States to choke on the Israeli shit bagel. But I think that US and Iran worked behind the scenes to avoid further escalation. Because it's no secret that Israel helped sell the US invasion of Iraq. I don't know how much you've kept track of this or how much you've dug into it, but there's a presentation of Netanyahu holding up a picture of literally a cartoon bomb with the text like 90%, and claims that Iraq is 90% complete with their WMD program. There's also a long video of Netanyahu giving testimony. I don't know if it's sworn testimony, but testimony before Congress, where he swears up and down that taking down Saddam in Iraq will have extreme positive reverberations throughout the region, that Iraq is a exporter of terrorism, and that they are developing and very close to WMD. All of which turned out to be complete fucking shit. I mean, Iraq is a cluster fuck right now. There was no WMD whatsoever, no positive reverberations, and as far as I can tell, I don't think Saddam actually exported any terrorism or funded any kind of stuff that the U.S. does with the Green Berets all the goddamn time, with meddling in internal foreign defense or foreign internal defense. All right, so it's no secret either that Israel has been desperate to lobby the U.S. to do the same to Iran ever since. So Netanyahu feels that he manipulated the U.S. into going to war with Iraq, and he really has been working on doing the same to Iran. Now, most of you, most people who actually have honest curiosity about the conflict ever since October actually went out and found the document 2009 Global Language Dictionary, which is basically a guidebook for how to be a propagandist on behalf of Israel. It has polling data, it has talking points, it has how do you communicate these points, focus on emotions first, make sure people believe that you care, paint a nice future, blah, 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 blah. There's an entire section in that document that you can find online with talking points that a hasbarist or propagandist should use when speaking to influencers, policymakers, decision makers, or just in somebody in the general public about the necessity for the US to launch a strike against Iran with literally a bunch of bullshit. But it includes talking points. It includes, painting Iran as this big destabilizing power that's an extremely oppressive regime, and that the United States should engage in a war of liberation against Iran. Netanyahu also provided a laughable PowerPoint containing inconvertible proof, which contained no proof at all, really. But Israel also has a long history of launching unprovoked attacks against Iran. And just between 2010 and I believe 2023, up until like March or something like that, there were, I think, 24 different attacks attributed to Israel against Iran. And keep in mind, those are only the ones that we know of. I mean, it's kind of gross. It's almost like when, if you ask a dude, like, hey, do you have kids? Are you a dad? And he goes, no, not that I know of. I'm like, okay, all right. Anyways, so the way that Iran defends itself or deters from attack, because it doesn't have its own air force, but it has an air defense. And it has a very extensive drone and ballistic missiles and hypersonic missile program. However, aside from that, it also operates a network of proxies. Well, operates is the wrong word. It cultivates and develops proxies in the region. What I mean by that is that, as far as I can tell, Iran does not dictate to these proxies what they shall do. They build them up in order to have them as allies, but they have autonomy. In other words, the way Iran sees it is the US and United States allies have destabilized the region for so long that there are no stable allies for Iran to have. Therefore, it needed to build its own allies. And if you want to have good allyship that's not built on Machiavellian coercion, what would you do? You would probably train somebody up, get them to really love you for what you're doing to them, and then you give them freedom so that your relationship is more that of being equals. It's pretty interesting because if you go and find old footage of Soleimani, the Iranian general that was assassinated under the Trump administration, he was the one who traveled around and helped train up all of these various resistance groups. You could tell that, sure, there was deference, like a respect between himself and whoever he met with, but there was never salutes or the rigid hierarchy that you would find in a Western military, where a private salutes a lieutenant, a colonel, a general, whatever else. So Iran focused much more on a flat hierarchy, and its proxies it considered as equals. Sure, it supplied them with weapons, it provided them training, but it treated them as equals. Now, this can, to some degree, be confirmed because if we read the Director of National Intelligence report, it actually states that Iran did not order October 7th nor the Houthi blockade. Now, Iran also corroborates the same thing, basically saying, like, okay, we don't actually work using proxies. We have built our own allies. It's a pretty different way of doing things compared to the way we do them in the West with this colonial mindset. But anyways, how do we end up where we kind of are today, where there's this game behind the scenes to manage escalations between Iran and Israel? So basically, Netanyahu faces imprisonment and very likely the of course the end of his political career once the war winds down, and this is due to corruption charges in Israel that have led to massive protests. Just keep one thing in mind and do not get this twisted whatsoever. The Israelis protesting against Netanyahu and who were protesting against Netanyahu were not peaceniks whatsoever. They did not give a flying fuck about Palestinians. They did not give a flying fuck about the fact that they've got apartheid right outside their doorstep. They do not see Palestinians as humans. In fact, Ilan Pape confirmed this, that when the Palestinians approached these anti-Netanyahu groups to say, "Hey, can we tack on our liberation movement onto your movement as well?" They were basically told, "Fuck off, like screw off. We don't care about you. The only problem we have is that this corrupt son of a bitch is in power. Like, he basically everything we say about Putin, Netanyahu actually is." Anyways, this is why Netanyahu refused to accept hostages on humanitarian grounds for free, which were offered by Hamas in the earliest days of the war. Basically, Hamas looked at some of the people they'd taken hostage and went, "Holy fuck, you're not going to survive for very long because, you need medicine, you need all this kind of shit. You're going to be a strain on our resources." So Hamas basically said, like, "Look, Israel, you can have these 3, 4 people back for free. We don't even need anything." And Israel flat out fucking refused. Completely refused to coordinate anything with them. And the reason why that happened is because Netanyahu does not want the hostages back. Like, every time a hostage gets released through political means is a defeat for Netanyahu. Because otherwise, remember when there was a ceasefire? There were a lot of hostages that were released from Gaza into Israeli hands. That's the only time, I think, except for 2 supposed hostages in, I believe, February, that were supposedly freed in Rafah. And there have been some conflicting reports on when those hostages were liberated or not, and whether it's kind of a fake story. Anyways, the continuation of the massacre or genocide of Gaza, we could call it a plausible genocide, at least according to the ICJ, no matter what a Hasbarist will try to tell you. Continuing that massacre slash genocide gives him more time in office. And so we have to ask ourselves a question here. Is Netanyahu so deluded, or is Israeli society so messed up that the hypothetical defeat of Iran by Israeli perfidy, would that be enough for Netanyahu to re-win favor among Israelis and remain in office? Alternatively, could that outcome be enough for Netanyahu to feel that he has fulfilled, or that he has left a legacy after him? Anyways, in order to achieve this, and now bear in mind, the hawkish neocons in the US, neoconservatives, have been pushing for the US to directly attack Iran. A lot of this information, or a lot of these suggestions, come from think tanks in the US that are sponsored by Israeli money for Israeli purposes, and then this message is then repeated by Israeli AIPAC funded Congress people and politicians. So anyways, in order to try to do a forcing move, as when you play in chess, where you make a move where you force somebody to respond in a certain way, Israel bombed Iran's consulate in Damascus, which is basically the same as attacking a country itself. And they did it in a direct and public act, rather than behind the scenes or as part of any kind of shadow war where there's plausible deniability. And at the same time, no actor in the so called rules based world order condemned the act. I mean, Jesus Christ. So if you literally want to prove the critics of international law, who claim that international law is nothing more than a tool in the Western toolkit to oppress the global South and to pretend to be moral and civilized, the West has literally proven every single last one of those criticisms in the past 6 months. But I don't think the US can afford to go to war with Iran because it's already spread thin. Think of the Russia-Ukraine war. Think of China and Taiwan and the Red Sea costing a bunch of resources. Now we've got Iran and the tensions there. As also, the United States and the West's relationship with the global South has been weakening massively over the past 6 months for the reason I just stated a little bit earlier. The global South has literally seen that the West imposes a bunch of standards and rules on them in the global South, but none on themselves. So they play by different rules, and at the same time, they lecture the global South on a bunch of stuff. So in other words, the Western world goes ahead and performs a genocide, or a plausible genocide. They don't condemn it. They claim that this country, which purports to have Western values, and which is basically a vassal state and one of the last colonial outposts in the world, has every right to defend themselves. And then they refuse to do to that country what every single global southern country knows would happen to them if they did the same thing. I mean, Iraq broke like 2 resolutions, got invaded. Most countries break 1 resolution, or they do like anything the US does not want them to do and they get invaded. Like, tons of people die. Israel does whatever the fuck it wants because it's a vassal state of the EU, as like a colonial project, gets away with it. Anyways. Now, the position geopolitically that the US is in. Now, keep this in mind. I think if the US came to the conclusion that they could, without a doubt, win a war against Iran, like a decisive victory similar to the one they won in Iraq, they would go in a heartbeat. However, Iran has been able to watch what the US does and how it conducts operations in its own backyard, in its own terrain, and that's what they've been preparing for all of these years. Because now the United States have already shown their hand, what they do with troops on the ground, what they do with the drones, how they attack, what tactics they use, what strategies they employ. Together with the fact that the U.S. is spread thinly, the United States does not consider themselves capable of keeping up all of these various theaters at the same time while also invading Iran. And on the Iranian side, my understanding is that Iran is relatively close to developing their nuclear power. And it does not want these facilities to be targeted and have to restart its program again. So they don't want Israeli fighter jets to come in and wreck everything one more time, because I think they're already probably 20 years behind schedule, or at the very least, at least 10 years, between all the assassinations of their physicists, etc., as well as Stuxnet and literally bombing research facilities. So this was actually confirmed by Reuters this morning, so I had to re-record this video. But my thesis was that US and Iran coordinated the Iranian response to specifically be one where it allows Israel to prove its security while also allowing Iran to save face and seems to have some level of parity. And Reuters reported this morning that Iran gave up to 72 hours of heads up to all of Israel's allies in the territory, so basically that they could mount their defense for the attack in order to mitigate the impact so that it removes Israel's legitimate ability to respond. Now, Israel could still respond because they want to drag the world into war again. But basically, confirmation points for this thought or this theory is that the response took 13 days. So they took a long. And normally, a response to something like this would be far more immediate. It would be max within a day or two. Because these situations already exist on a decision matrix somewhere, usually. You will have, if our nemesis country, our arch nemesis, does X, we do Y. If they do Z, we do B, etc., etc., etc. These things are already planned out. But now it took 13 days. And why would it take 13 days? Because first of all, you need to make sure that whatever response you mount does not escalate beyond a point that you can still control. So 13 days gave them enough days to warn that there will be a response, to have back channels opened up with the U.S., because the U.S. is one of the major key stakeholders in this, as well as Russia probably, as well as China. And to coordinate, okay, what would a good response look like here where everybody saves face and Israel does not have a case to proceed anymore. And another proof point here is that the United States and her spin doctors are placing a lot of emphasis on congratulating Israel for having intercepted, these are like Zelensky levels of propaganda, like 703% of all the inbound projectiles. Actually, they report 99%, but you get the point, right? What's really interesting here is when you look at the success rate of like the Iron Dome and David Sling, and this entire multi-layer defense system that Israel has, it has like a reported success rate of like 70 to 80% or something like that. Depends on the source you go to. But suddenly, a complex this attack, it intercepted 99% of everything. That could be true, but that would probably be true only if Iran more or less only sent these slow drones, because the Shahad, it travels less than, I believe, 200 kilometers an hour, which is pretty damn easy to intercept. Also, Biden has communicated that the U.S. will not participate in hostile actions towards Iran. Now, is that true or not? Don't really know. Anyways, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few days, because Israel is basically like, imagine when you were a kid and you lived on the street and there was one little puny, shitty freaking kid with a horrible attitude who everybody hated. And the reason that they hated this kid was because this kid would ruin all your games. They would want to play with everybody else's toys. They would show up and be violent and kick you in the legs unless you did exactly what they wanted to, but they had a really mean, strong big brother. And the big brother basically said, I don't care what my little brother does to you. If you do anything to my little brother, I will kick your ass. Well, now the big brother is in his own fight. And he's on crutches as well. And the little brother is too stupid to recognize what's going on with the big bro, so he's still picking a fight with everybody in the neighborhood. Now, of course, if you read the news, you'll see that Jordan, for instance, decided to side with the puny little bully, but we'll see where this ends up. Now, we also have to consider one last thing, which is, let's pretend that World War III does break out. The majority of the world at this point in the West have come to realize that if they were to pick up arms, if they were to get drafted, that it would literally be for Israeli interests. It would be based off of the fact that Israel refused to stop conducting a genocide. They would know that it's because their own political leaders refused to take actions condemning Israel, and that they would be on the wrong side of history. I think the majority of people have come to this conclusion. So even if you were to try to mount a defense, you would not have many people who would actually sign up to defend you. Interesting times. Anyways, I'll see you next time. I hope you like this. Adios.